All right, let's get started. If Owen comes in a little late, that's no problem. So, welcome to the City Council Ordinance Committee meeting of June 30th. This is a remote meeting due to COVID-19 restrictions. I have a statement to read, which is the City of Easthampton would like to remind everyone that wearing your mask when you cannot maintain at least 6 feet of social distancing is still very important to prevent the surge of COVID-19 and the need to go back to stricter precautions. Please wear your mask, maintain your space, and wash your hands. So that is our public service announcement for today. And I think it's needed, honestly. So I think one of the things I wanted to just check in with you, Tom, before we get into approving minutes, because Owen did send out some minutes.
Is that Owen down there, by the way, that just joined?
Oh,
hey.
Maybe. Hey.
I'm on a phone, so I'm sorry if I'm in and out. I apologize.
That's no worries. That's no worries. I just opened the meeting.
Okay.
Yeah. So, hey, Owen, you can weigh in on this too. I was noticing that on our agenda for tonight, we don't have engine brake ordinance, but on our agenda for tomorrow night, we do still have the engine brake ordinance on there. We never dismissed that, did we? And if we did, did Barbara just not?
Last I remember, what we were doing, we were sort of, the police said that they were going to step up enforcement and talk to some of the main offenders and see if the activity that was bothering the residents would slow down.
Right.
Since what they were if I'm remembering this correctly, what they were doing was already illegal with the modded out mufflers and everything. So
right.
They were going to just see if they could enforce that a little bit more, and maybe there wasn't a need for new legislation. Yeah,
that's what I thought.
Maybe it would make sense to reach out to some of those residents and see if they've noticed any shift.
A reduction. Yeah. Yeah, because my impression was that we were just putting it on hold, that we didn't necessarily take it off of our agenda. But I'm going to have to, I guess I'll just ask Barbara to get it back on our committee agenda as opposed to just on our city council agenda. Okay,
yeah, that's my recollection. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, go for it, Owen.
I was going to say that was my recollection as well, that we kind of agreed to put it on pause, but not remove it from the agenda, just that we were going to circle back to it, and that everything that Tom and you just said, that Sergeant Ross was going to talk to the trucking companies. They did put a couple speed signs and I think a detail up on Florence Road, and anecdotally, the residents up there, my neighbors who had kind of initiated a lot of this process, they haven't reached out to me recently with any complaints. Now, that's not to necessarily say that they don't have complaints, but I haven't heard anything.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, so I'll ask Barbara to put this back on our agenda, and or at least our committee agenda, so we can discuss it further. If there is anything to discuss, So let's. Oh, and I saw that you gave us some minutes. It looks like they're the minutes. Let me just back up here really quick.
I think they're 4/9 and 4/21, if I remember correctly.
I think that is right. Let me just make sure I have it exactly, because I have to. So 4/9 and 4/21. And I don't, Tom, did you have any chance to take a look at those? Is this something you feel comfortable with approving tonight?
Yeah, I can approve them.
Okay. All right. So let's. Thanks for doing that, Owen. Appreciate it.
Yep.
I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of 4/9 and 4/21.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. All right. Tom Peak.
Aye.
Owen Zarrett.
Yes.
And I vote yes too. So it passes 3-0. Beautiful. Now, this is going to take a little bit of getting used to. I'm controlling two mics here. So public speak time. I see that we have a couple members of our planner and one of the planning board members. If either of you would like to discuss anything that's not on our agenda, that would be a great time. Okay, seeing none. We have a few things. So Jeff, would you, before we get into what we had discussed the other night, do you want to just talk about the downtown business permitting that is new?
Sure, that's great, thank you.
Yeah.
So this is a new proposed amendment that, it's really coming in response to COVID. So some of the things that we're seeing, I guess as impacts from COVID are a couple, and I guess maybe we can't make the direct correlation, but it certainly seems like it's happening as a result or since COVID-19 really took effect in March, is a couple storefronts closing in our downtown business district. And, I'll be honest, it first started with puffer printing, which we do business there frequently. I think a lot of people do business there, and they close kind of quickly. And their storefront is actually 2 spaces. So upon their departure from Easthampton, which is sad, there's 2 vacant storefronts on Union Street. And it just became apparent to me that if we continued to see that trend, we wanted to try to do something. And I kind of was just, from a planning perspective and economic development and things like that, any effort to streamline permitting, or on the flip side, to reduce barriers for new businesses to locate in Easthampton, we should be trying to do that. I think that this has long been on the list. A couple of years ago, there was a discussion at the planning board about making an administrative approval process to kind of do almost the same thing. Nothing ever happened, and we've been kind of blessed ever since that we've had good tenant selection going into buildings. It hasn't really been an issue. So the idea is that for new uses that are going into existing buildings in the downtown business district, we have an opportunity to reduce some of the permitting requirements and make it easier for new businesses to go in, especially if they're not making any substantial changes to the building. And what's happening now is I don't know if you want to if you want me to share. I started to compile some other information that wasn't in the initial packet. So can you make it so that I could share a screen, because it's just an illustration that I'm working on as we go into public hearings and then bring it to City Council. I'm
going to make you a co-host, which I think would allow you to share.
Okay, I think it looks like I have the ability to do that.
Okay, good.
Okay, so this is information it's sort of a working document at this point. I intend to put the addresses here and just describe maybe what their previous use was. But now, since we kind of put forth the amendment to move it into the process, Taylor Real Estate has relocated from Main Street to Liberty Street, which is great because they stayed in Easthampton, but it creates a vacant storefront on Main Street. And in kind of looking at this a little more closely, it becomes a little bit more urgent that we try to do whatever we can to reduce the barriers. And I had been thinking, what can I do as the planner to help? And we are trying to come up with grant programs to help people with money and rent and things like that. But aside from giving people money, what can we do? And the streamlined permitting is really important. So the next picture here is also on I think people call this Bank Row, but that the hair salon left a while ago, probably pre-COVID, and then there's another vacant storefront on the left, which I think used to be Goat Pete Strings. So now that's 3 storefronts just in that one block that we have vacant. And then the other building that is of note is the Bank of America building. So in looking at these 3 buildings in particular, they are ready to be occupied. So they're all, they've all had existing uses in them, and right now, a person to change a use. So if you did not do a realtor, you might be subject to the planning board. Applicants have to pay, we approximate $400 permitting fees, and it takes, at the quickest, it takes 2 months. So those are real tangible barriers that we can move if someone can go in there without substantial changes to the building. So then going to Union Street, the picture on the top is the puffer printing place, the storefronts, and that, again, that's 2 that they're like turnkey ready for someone to go in there. And luckily I haven't had to have the conversations yet, but in conversations with Taylor, they're willing to come to the public hearing and talk a little bit about what they've experienced. But basically, they talk to tenants or prospective tenants, and then they have to tell them, oh, you need to go talk to the planning department, and you need to draw a plan, and there's some fees, and then there's 2 months before you can actually get in there. This building has been released for sale for a while. This is next to Manchester. But as you can see, this building has 2 means of egress right in the front. So this is also ready equipped. It's handicapped accessible. So a business could go in there without substantial changes to the exterior. And then this was to be a restaurant, but now the first floor is vacant. And there are no substantial changes necessary to get in there. So then finally, where it gets to be a little bit more urgent when you put all these together, there's also the vacant Majestic Theater, so it's the center space. This also used to be some kind of hair salon or stylist, and that's released now on Cottage Street. And then this building front is being renovated, which will also now be a storefront. So when you look at the big picture in our downtown, there are a growing number of vacancies, and this amendment will help make that process easier. So they'll have the basic criteria to meet in the zoning, and then they can work directly with the building department and building. So the text of the language is actually modeled after the town of Amherst has provision where no plan approval shall be required for the change in use. Changes other than sign will occur on the site or the building exterior. So that's the gist of it. And then in the packet, this is the packet going to council. I tried to just, always remind people kind of how the zoning works. We have the table of uses, and then we have the downtown business district highlighted, and a P means that you can just do it without any permitting, but a PA means use permitted by site plan approval from the planning board. So what I tried to highlight here, I tried to insert what this would look like. So there's a footnote here, number 10. So you would apply the footnote throughout this section, but these are the uses that we're looking at. So under retail and service, anything with a PA means that it would go to the planning board for plan approval, which in theory means that the planning board would have a very, very difficult time denying the use. It's as of right. So we think that there's this opportunity to potentially remove this barrier for all these uses that are plan approval. So the one I did not highlight, and I think I should have, was supermarket, this number 10. The key factor being that if they could occupy a building without substantial exterior changes, then they might be eligible. I think for a supermarket, unless existing supermarket, I think would be challenging. But this includes all other retail establishments, restaurants, bakery, deli, butcher, catering, all these things that we actually come to know and love about the downtown are the uses that we're trying to make it easier for people to get in. I guess bed and breakfast would also be highlighted, but I missed that one. I think I'm not even sure we have any bed and breakfast downtown. And then hotel. So the rest of these in the ordinance here, these dashes mean that the use is not even allowed. So we don't have to worry about, another, auto repair shop going into downtown because they're not currently allowed anyway. So that's
right.
Kind of the quick summary.
Okay, and that sounds really good. Thanks for that. It seems like, to me, it makes a ton of sense, especially as you kind of highlight all of the places that right now are vacant. So basically, this is since it's a zoning change, this would be a similar process as what we're going through with so we would send this to the planning board, and then we would have a joint public hearing with them. It does kind of seem like this is something that we would probably want to try to have happen, and the discussions happen sooner rather than later. Is that a correct assumption?
I think that would be ideal. I'm always kind of just trying to chart out the process. So, there is an opportunity if the three of you vote favorably to keep moving this forward, then I think my understanding is maybe tomorrow night during the full city council meeting, could you move to schedule a joint public hearing?
Yes. I could move it to have it sent to the planning board and back to us.
Well, see, that's the thing that this is definitely part of the process that is confusing, but like the planning board,
it's confusing, yeah. The
planning board initiated this, so they sent it.
Okay.
So they've already. I don't know that it needs to go back. I think sorry.
Yeah, I don't think it. I think it's basically. What we would do is we would say that we want to initiate the process of having the joint collaboration with the planning board. So as far as scheduling the hearing, we could do that. I think generally the way that we've always done it is that we send it back to the planning board with the expectation that we are going to have a joint public hearing.
Okay.
I mean, not that it really matters all that much, but.
Okay, and I don't know if you would have to set a date with your motion, like tomorrow at full council. I don't know if you would have to set a date.
I don't think we would. I think if we had a date, that would be great. But I don't think that is part of because basically I think, when we technically send it back to the planning board and say that we want to initiate the process, then it starts that clock. What is it? The 90-day clock or I can't remember. I used to have a flow chart that I used to keep with me.
Yep.
But so I don't think that is going to be a problem. Let me just have Owen and Tom weigh in here. What do you guys think about this? Tom, do you want to start?
About the process or about the substance of the
about the substance and whether you feel comfortable about sending this to the planning board so we can get the joint public hearing going.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I don't think that we should be charging people when they're not if they're not making any changes, there's not really anything to review. If they're just using the existing space, I don't see why we should be jamming them up on that. So I'm in favor. I think this is smart, and I don't. Yeah, so I'm fine with this, and I'm fine sending it, back so that we can start talking about it with the planning board.
Perfect. Owen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we basically have a recommendation from the planning board and the planner to do something planning related that affects their, how they work, things work for them. So I'm not going to argue. Ultimately, the work falls on them, and if they think that this is the best way to manage, and I agree with the source and substance of the plan. So yeah, I don't have an issue with it, and I'd be interested in trying to move it forward as quickly as we can.
That sounds wonderful. And in that case, I'd be happy to entertain a motion to send this to the planning board and recommend to the full council that we initiate a joint public hearing.
I think that's great. And then, in terms of scheduling, what I have my calendar up here. So, we don't have enough. So when you send it to the joint public hearing, there's actually 2 more public hearings. So there'll be a joint public hearing with the Ordinance Committee and Planning Board, and then the final one with the council. So the calendar that I kind of laid out would, they already have, the Planning Board and Ordinance already have a hearing continued to July 14th. And then planning board meets on the 21st normally, and so I can do a little bit of legwork to confirm some dates, but I was looking at like July 28th. If that were available for people, then we have enough time to set up the legal ad that has to run in the paper like the July 14th, July 21st. We can have the hearing on the 28th, and then out of that, City Council would have to hold a public hearing, and that's the harder part. I don't know that we can do it that first meeting in August. That would be ideal, but I don't know if it's possible.
Now, here's a question for you, Jeff. Is the 14th too early? So if we continued the public hearing from the other night and then had a separate piece of business that same night, do you think that's jamming too much? I mean, because this one to me seems pretty easy. Yeah. But just a thought.
Technically, I think the hearing needs to be advertised for 14 days. So we don't have enough time to get it set up for the same night as the 14th. So it could be the week of the 20th. But
I think the 28th is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm fine with the 28th. And if that is a better timeline, I just figured, if we could combine it, then why not? But if logistically the 28th is probably going to be fine.
Yeah.
Tom, Owen, how does that work for you guys?
The 28th is fine. Well, sorry, Owen, you were saying something?
No, go ahead, Tom.
I think he deferred to you, Tom.
Okay. The 28th is fine for me. What I was going to ask is, would there, because you were saying you weren't sure about whether we'd be able to have a city council public hearing for our August 5th meeting. Do you is the issue that perhaps if something were to get amended in the joint public hearing, that it would be like that what we'd be advertising wouldn't necessarily be exactly what we'd be discussing? Is that your concern?
I don't know. I guess this would be where I would probably want to consult with the city clerk on maybe some past practice. But the only thing would be that if there was a joint public hearing on the 28th, I guess we could I'm willing to certainly try. Then we would have to run 2 concurrent, legal ads and have a legal ad published for August 5th for the city council to hold a public hearing. And if something became misaligned, then the city council might have to convene on the 5th, which you will be anyway, and just continue it.
Right.
It'll go all the way to September. So,
or we could, just one thought, none of us are going on vacation right now, right? In our houses. So if we had to hold a special meeting sometime later in August, I don't think that, I don't think there's that many people who'd be unable to make it.
Right. And just also to put out there, we do have a special city council meeting August 19th.
Oh, you do?
Yes. So we got a message from the president that she had a July 15th meeting and an August 19th meeting. Now, those are supposed to be pared down meetings, but I don't think there would be, we could ask and see if there was any objection to us holding this public hearing on the August 19th meeting.
That would be a great target. The way it works is that if the city council public hearing, so once the city council votes on the amendment, it becomes effective the next day. So,
Okay.
you know, if you're an applicant looking to get into one of those spaces, that would be way better, because I think
It would be way better.
we're talking about a month that they would be kind of waiting, but otherwise the scenario plays out. I mean, it's not substantially worse, but I think the next possible time it would be like September 2nd meeting. So it saves 2 weeks, which if for a person getting ready to pay rent, you know, on a space, 2 weeks, not nothing.
It's not nothing. So no, I think that's great. Let's what I'll do, Jeff.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Owen. Sorry.
So, Jeff, just clarify this for me.
Yeah.
The planning board already has essentially given their voted favorably on this. Is that correct?
Yeah, my understanding of the process is that, you know, I brought it to the planning board and asked them to sponsor it. So the planning board, you know, the planning board brought this to, you know, basically the planning board brought this to council on June 10th, and then it come into ordinance, and then the next step would be the joint public hearing. Planning board.
So the planning board moved this forward to the city council without any recommendations to change it, correct?
No changes were proposed. You know, there was a question that I think when we're in the public hearing, the one question that we did hear was what is a substantial change? And so I am working on that. I mean, I think in talking to the building inspector, you know, we will need to acknowledge that if someone needs to make a storefront compliant with ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, then we probably don't want to consider that substantial. So we want to be able to have them upgrade if it needs to have a ramp or something, or a different door, you know, with the push button. You know, those should be included in this, you know, not substantial. And then things beyond that, you know, is where you get substantial. Definitely, like in addition to a building, if you're going to add on something, then that's going to trigger you back to the planning board. The only other question is that one picture that I showed, the building that's being renovated on Cottage Street. So they had converted it to an apartment a long time ago. So if I was going to do it, if you look at Google Maps, and I'll do it for the public hearing, but there were walls with windows and a door, and they're basically taking the wall out, they're putting in new windows to make it like an actual storefront. So
that's good news.
It is good news, and it's so those are the kinds of basic questions. I was just going to share this again. So this is the building here. So
right
behind the wood is going to be 2 new pieces of glass, just like the place to the right, which is actually an improvement to bring it more back to what you would expect on a street front. So that's the one
I think
that the planning board mentioned was, you know, what is substantial? And then Brenda's here too, and I don't know if I'm missing something, but.
Brenda, do you have anything you want to add?
No, Jeff, I think you captured that right. We all agreed there needs to be a little more specifics around it, but we just wanted to move it along as fast as possible so that we could all talk about it together and hammer out some of the details. But Jeff, that's right.
Great.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just wondering if there was a way that we can get this to the first week of August, but it sounds like, especially Mr. Chairman, you feel that probably the second meeting of August is probably best.
Yeah, I think probably the second meeting would give everybody the time that they need to put all the pieces in place. Jeff, do you agree with that?
You know, I don't want to push it too hard. I mean, I want to be respectful of everyone's process. That said, I mean, if we advertise for a public hearing on the 28th, you know, we could advertise. I think there might need to be a discussion with the city council president to understand like what if it's too much. But if we're advertising for a joint public hearing on the 28th, we could also advertise for the city council hearing on the 5th. It's the same difference. It's just 2 weeks later. So I need to do I think I need to talk to the clerk as well. I just need to make sure I'm not overstepping a process that I'm not aware of.
When you do,
And I can talk to Peg as well. No, that's fine. Go ahead, Tom.
when you do speak to the city clerk about that, one thing that I might recommend asking about is how much of a problem it would be, because I know that there have been times where we've sent something to committee and scheduled a public hearing for 2 weeks later, like at the same time. And the one thing that I feel like I've heard Barb be a little nervous about is like what happens in the case that something gets amended heavily in committee. And so what people are showing up to speak about for what they saw in the newspaper is not the same as what like the item is at the point that it was advertised.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of a problem that is, especially if in the case of a public hearing, we, by all likelihood, we will be still remote at that time. So it wouldn't be difficult to just digitally, I don't know, whatever. I just want to make sure that process-wise, that's not an issue, given that the planning board has already stated that there's some specificity they'd like. So there likely will be changes between tomorrow and whenever the public hearing is.
I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff, was I right that we just needed to define a little bit what major changes meant?
Yeah. I would say that I don't think there's any, this is just a minor variation of what you said, Tom. I don't think there's any changes between now and tomorrow, or I think the discussion really, the next level of discussion needs to happen on the 28th, and that would be where we get potential changes. So, I'm okay with knowing, I didn't know that there was a special meeting in mid-August in starting the meeting tonight. I think I'm comfortable. If we aim for the 28th for the joint public hearing, I think that is when the language will get fleshed out. And then basically the way it works for me is that I would be submitting the legal ad 2 days later with the final language that we then vetted, and that would go for the public hearing on the 19th. I'm fine with that. I don't want to push it too hard. That gives due process, so that I think what Tom was saying. So on the 28th, we'll hammer out language, and then we'll publish the city council hearing with the language that was determined.
Yeah, that's what I figured would be probably the best. That way we're not rushed. Because it's true, Tom. Barbara likes to have the exact language when we set the public hearing. So if there was any changes, that might potentially pose a problem. Okay, I think that's good. Tom, do you or Owen, do either of you want to make a motion to send this to the planning board and ask the city council if we can engage in the joint public hearing?
Second.
All right, beautiful. So we have a motion to send the downtown business permitting amendment to the planning board and back to us. Tom Peak.
Aye.
Owen Zarrett.
Just point of clarification, do we have to ask for full council approval for the joint public hearing? Don't we just move it, or no?
It has to be, I mean, it's just a vote. But we do have to vote to have the joint public hearing, or to send it back to the planning board.
But that from the full council or just from ordinance?
Just so, no, the full council has to vote to send it to the planning board.
Okay.
And then we can set.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but otherwise, I'm a yes. Aye.
You're a yes. Okay, I'm a yes too.
Yeah.
So it passes 3-0, and I'll do that tomorrow night, Jeff.
Yeah.
And what do we want to look? We're going to do the 28th. Is that correct?
I think we should. Can we pencil that in? And I think everyone's been responsive because I think everyone's home. I may try to furnish an email either tonight or tomorrow morning, just polling you three and the planning board members to make sure that we can get everyone on the 28th. So I'll have confirmation of a date for city council tomorrow night.
Sure.
Okay, that's perfect.
I'm available.
I'm available too. And if I'm not, like for some miracle that I get to go somewhere, I should have my phone or computer, so I should be good. So I'm just gonna put that temporarily in there for the 28th. All right, that sounds good. So let's move on. I just wanted to. So tonight I invited Councilor Kwasinski to come to discuss his amendment, which would change cannabis establishment residential setbacks from 75 feet to from 25 feet to 75 feet. And so Councilor Kwasinski called me earlier. He is not going to be able to join us tonight because he's not going to be able to deliberate this issue right now, because he has a client who has a property in the zone that we're talking about. So he would have to recuse himself because of conflict of interest. And I told him basically that, there was two paths we could go by, and I was going to run it by the committee. That we could either just dismiss this without prejudice, and he could request for it to come back at a later time, or we could have it sit on the agenda, and he was fine with either of those. And I know, Jeff, I would like to get your thoughts on this, because, as a broader review of the cannabis zoning and highway business, this is a relevant topic, but I just want to, I just want to get some input from folks and what the course that everybody feels comfortable proceeding on. I don't know if I think Owen might have just got home.
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Good.
So actually, I'm gonna hang up on my phone, and I'm gonna log on Zoom. So I'll see you guys in 60 seconds.
Yeah, sounds good. Yep. Perfect. So Jeff, as far as like the broader discussion here, is this something that you want us to move forward with, or do you want, in relation to what we're already talking about, or is this something that you think that we might need to bring a broader set of, like, looking at some of the highway business zoning, not just this one extra piece? Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I think that during the first joint public hearing with the Ordinance and Planning Board, I think there was a discussion about, the scope that you have with the other amendment, which is, about cultivation in highway business. I think we all agreed that you have, in considering that amendment, that's in public hearing, I think that you have the authority to talk about whether there should be a separation from cultivation buildings to setbacks. I think that's where we all agreed. I think the question was, is that what the groups want to do, right? So there was a question of, can we, and then, which I think the answer is yes, but the other question was, should we? And the should we, I don't think we answered, but I think I could be mistaken, but that was my understanding, that we can, in considering the cannabis, we can talk about all sorts of things. We could talk about building height, we can talk about building location, we can talk about setbacks, we can talk about design. So that is a yes in my mind, but whether we should is unresolved at this point.
Okay.
Right?
And I actually, this is something that I was thinking about, because I know that we discussed it at the joint hearing. And the original packet that the proposal that you had put forward, did mention specifically, kind of parameters, setting potential parameters. So I feel like that was something, since it was included with the original paperwork, and it this is so germane to our discussion that I agree with you that I think that this is, that we can look at these things as we go through this process. As far as setbacks, I feel like, should we talk about it? I think it warrants discussion. All of these things, like how many stories can one of these buildings be? How far from the road should they be? I feel like those warrant a discussion. I don't know. For example, a setback, if we're talking about odor has it's not something that is contained within 25 feet. Odor tends to gravitate. And so as I looked at this particular proposal, I didn't quite understand necessarily the impact that a 50 feet would make. I mean, if you go down the bike path and National Nonwovens is, or one of the factories that's right on the bike path is putting out an odor, that's hundreds of feet away. So. Oh, and I saw you had a hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched about this a few times during previous meetings, and certainly specifically in regards to this proposal. So regarding cannabis in general, we actually already have within the ordinance which we created verbiage to manage odors. I have to look it up specifically, but there's very specific wording about noxious odors, et cetera, and that the operator of any business needs to manage these. And so creating setbacks which purport to manage odors, although again, I haven't received any data or background to demonstrate any precedent for using setbacks as odor management for cannabis establishments specifically. At any of the meetings prior to this, we've requested that a few times from the counselor who put this forward. It's redundant. Like, why are we creating redundancies? There's other ways to manage odor via filtration systems, et cetera. And again, the language is already in place. I also think that, putting these setbacks in place seems completely arbitrary to me. Where the 75 feet come from? And of course, again, it's biased towards a very specific industry. As you pointed out, Chairman Derby, there's many other industries within the city that create quote unquote noxious odors. And I think that particularly in the language provided here, it's this a concept that the odor of cannabis cultivation is more offensive than the odor of chemicals or agricultural equipment or manure, et cetera. So I find this to be, what's the term, arbitrary and capricious. It's bias. I don't really see the point of it. I think it's very business unfriendly. And if you want to have a discussion about 75-foot setbacks with abutting residential plots for every single industry in the city, sure. I don't really like that idea either. I think it makes it very difficult. It almost creates it creates an inequity for building. If you want to purchase a lot and spend a lot of money and then build a building where now you have to have a 75-foot setback, I'm not buying it. I don't like it. This particular one, especially the counselor introduced it. I understand that he has a conflict of interest, so I think we should just remove it. Regarding the other issues that came up during the joint public hearing, I just think, as per our conversation earlier, we have to make sure that that language is then somehow advertised. The initial language just had to do with modifying that section, whether you can or can't use new buildings for cannabis establishments. So if we're going to start talking about square footage and height and appearance and et cetera, A, I think that needs to apply across all industries, and B, we need to introduce at least some semblance of language. So,
Tom? Thanks, Owen.
So I just want to suggest what Councilor Zarrett was just saying about that other stuff. I feel like that there's a separate conversation that I think I want to have there in a second about that. So about sort of what our process is next time we go in to talk with the planning board. So just before we get to that, I want to talk to this and just say that, where I am right now is, my normal philosophy, and I've said this to you guys a bunch of times, is that, if we as the local government are going to put some restrictions on what people can do, I want to see that there's someone who's clearly being harmed, right? That there's a need for that restriction. And I want to see that this restriction will address that harm. I'm open-minded to the possibility that there's an issue here and this would fix it. But absent any information on that, I can't vote on it. I understand that, Councilor Kwasinski's situation is difficult. I also have conflicts of interest sometimes, so it's tough. And I sympathize with that. But I need somebody. For me, I'm personally leaning towards dismissing this without prejudice right now. And then if somebody, be it a member of the community or another counselor or whatever, wants to come forward and give me, make a case for why this is addressing an actual problem, then I'm very open-minded to listen. But until then, just continuing it on the agenda with no indication that we're ever going to get that information, given the counselor's conflict of interest, seems like just a waste of ink on our agendas.
I agree. I think well said. Unless you guys have anything else you'd like to talk about on this particular subject, I'm happy to entertain a motion.
Sure, I'll move to dismiss this item without prejudice.
Second.
Okay, let's see. Tom Peake.
Aye.
Owen Zarrett.
Aye.
And I vote in the affirmative. I vote yes. Passes 3-0. I will do that tomorrow night.
Okay.
So let me just write down. Okay, great. Now, as far as the other topic that we were talking about, I just want to, because I know that both of my colleagues mentioned that they weren't super comfortable discussing potentially some of the other parameters around besides just allowing cultivation in new buildings. And I think that, and I understand that. I would say, as it relates to zoning, at least in my experience, because of the complexities of zoning and the nature of zoning, sometimes when you are discussing zoning issues, there are additional issues that are germane and relevant to the conversation, but would just be too burdensome to necessarily state we are going to discuss A, B, C, or D in the public's in whatever the statement. And I think as much as we can try to state it that we should. But for example, I wish I had the language in front of me, and I apologize for not having it. But I think that there was 3 options, potentially 4. Jeff, was it 3 or 4 options? And I know the last option specifically stated 3 options. Specifically stated that design standards and criteria around this allowing cultivation in the highway business. And since it explicitly stated that, I feel that we're probably in, and I'm happy to, if you guys aren't comfortable with it, I'm happy to figure out a way to mitigate that in some way. But I feel like within the purview of what we're looking at in highway business and cultivation, because design standards were mentioned, that kind of gives us the necessary allowance to be able to discuss certain aspects related to this. And Tom, I'm happy to hear your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm going to try and be structured about my thinking about this, which is sometimes a for me, so bear with me. So there's sort of two issues at play here. Now the one is, okay, when we're talking about should right now these facilities are not allowed in new buildings right now. And so there's a question we could say, we want to keep it that way. We could say, no, they should be allowed in new buildings, or they could say they should be allowed in new buildings, but here's the sort of like requirements that we would want to place on those new buildings. And I think that that's all fine. Here's where it gets tricky for me, is that, you know, one of the things that I've sort of said is that if the reason why we're imposing this restriction is not cannabis specific, if a similarly sized, like people had mentioned, for instance, and I think this is valid, blocking the view of Mount Tom. Okay, but if what we're saying is that we don't want buildings that could block Mount Tom, then any similarly sized building would do the same thing, and we should be saying that buildings of that size are not in general allowed in that area. And that, to me, is something that would have to be introduced as a separate thing, because there's all sorts of individuals involved in property development who might actually want to weigh in on this if they thought it would ever affect them. But if it's occurring within the context of just cannabis, they might not even think that this is something they need to be thinking about. Does that make sense?
I would say I can't agree with you more. I think that was well said, and that's a perfect illustration. And it's true. I mean, if we want to protect our view shed, then that is something that needs to be introduced separately. I think, as it relates to cannabis, one of the things that could potentially lead to that is us talking about, so this discussion could potentially lead to an introduction of a new item. Because I agree, it does sit strange with me that we would put a restriction on a cannabis cultivation facility, but not other facilities that would go in and have similar footprints.
And for what it's worth, by the way, I completely get Jeff's point of view from last time when he said, yeah, but there's not really that many industries that are willing to dump huge amounts of money into brand new large buildings. And this is kind of one of the ones that might. So I do get that. But just as a point of for my own comfort, I guess, if I'm going to be legislating for things that have nothing to do with the actual content of the building, then I want to see that. So there's,
okay.
Yeah,
go ahead.
A couple other things, but I saw Owen had his hand up.
You're on a roll, though, Councillor Peak. Do you want to continue?
Yeah, okay, sure. So here's where it gets tricky, is that I see there's basically, the tricky thing, right, is that we actually have, in the real world, so that's all me, like my ideals. But the more I think about it, in the real world, we actually have an applicant who is coming into a specific site and wants to put a specific building there. So, my idea of, let's just say that it's allowed, and then we can go back and think about design standards and uses in the highway building. There might be a gap in between those two pieces of sort of legislation passing where someone could potentially build something that actually is against these standards, and they weren't in place because we said that would kind of be unfair. And so that's where I'm trying to balance. And the one idea I had was to just say that, okay, and this is just sort of an idea I had the other day. I wanted to bounce it off you guys. We can talk design standards with the understanding that once this process is over, I'll go and just introduce those same design standards for all the rest of the buildings, or somebody else will, but there's I don't even know, actually, even saying that, I worry actually falls outside of open meeting law somehow. It's a really tricky thing when there's, what I'm saying, where there's something that's not on the agenda, but what we do here kind of affects it.
Right.
So I'm new to this stuff. I'm really interested in if you guys have any sort of suggestions on how we thread that needle.
Well, I mean, I think it's part of it is, you know, keeping the conversation germane to the topic that we have on our agenda, but not being so locked down that we can't say, this is a great idea, maybe we should bring this stuff forward for other types of buildings. Okay, and then that happens outside of the committee work, that as the individual counselor decides to do that. So I think that I think that we're pretty safe, and actually I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it would probably still leave us a little bit exposed, potentially, as far as the time it would take, unless we passed standards for, you know, cannabis cultivation and then said, okay, you know, someone's going to propose this exact same standards for other buildings in the zone, because other buildings, you know, probably wouldn't have the same momentum that this potentially could. But I'm curious to hear, Owen, you had something, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, so again, going back to redundancy, if we're gonna, you know, if we're gonna discuss building standards in terms of square footage, view shed, appearance, etc., I'd rather not kind of create one set of rules and then go back and basically just duplicate the rules for other industries. I'd rather have it be, you know, and again, we're wandering off a little bit here because we don't really have this exactly in front of us. So I would be more interested in discussing this as a general topic than creating it for one industry, i.e. cannabis, which I think we all agree in that moment is creating sort of some specific bias, industry bias. And again, you know, the original language that was introduced to us, the only place where it really talked about anything more than just a yay or nay in regards to new buildings was option 3, which included the language that said, or shall be situated on the parcel such that the cultivation facility / building is not prominently visible from the street, where it is not the singular use of the property. So that's kind of some of the stuff we're talking about, but none of it really got into, you know, some of the square footage we were discussing. You know, for me, I can only speak for myself. Going back into the public hearing, the only consideration I'm going to have is yes or no on whether we can allow new buildings for cannabis in highway business. And if prior to that time or around that time, if new agenda items are introduced that discuss general new zoning amendments or general zoning discussion around buildings and highway business, I'd be very happy to discuss it, you know, and move it forward in a rapid manner, since it's clearly on a forefront of some of the issues we're dealing with. But I'm nervous that we're wading into materials that have reasonably come up around the discussion, but haven't really been properly introduced into the conversation. Just my opinion.
Okay. Yep. No, and I appreciate that. Hey, Jeff. I'm hoping can you weigh in? And you know, and I think you know, there's a couple different interpretations here, but let me just ask you this: when a new, because I'm having a hard time remembering, when a new zoning amendment is proposed, at what point does it take kind of the wheels that have started turning? At what point does it apply to an applicant? Is it after the city council passes it and that's it? Or if it's under consideration, is there, I feel like, no. Okay. So.
No, I did some research for one of the previous ones. It's only applicable once the city council votes. So it's different in a city than in a town. So in a town, it is a different structure, but at first I did that a while ago. So, you know, the fact that we're discussing it, you know, we could still get a project that wouldn't have to meet anything that we're talking about until or if council were to vote it. That's when it's effective. I mean, you know, I know, I know that I'm sort of I pose these things as the planner to be objective, that I think that there is a balance, so that I see everything as a balance. I really try really hard to be objective and see things like that. That, you know, I think it's a full discussion, and I think that you, as a body, as two bodies holding a joint public hearing, I think there has to be another discussion at the next continued meeting to figure out how do you vote on this, and where will people fall on the voting. But my observation is not to continue to suggest any kind of bias towards cannabis industry, but I feel like people are failing to connect the fact that we have section 10.10, which is an entire section of zoning that applies solely to adult use cannabis establishments, that went through painstaking, levels of review to apply requirements to cannabis establishments. I know that there's a continuum of different sides of the story. Like, I'm sure I recall some of the discussions from 2018 that there shouldn't be, these certain things applied, but there were and there are. So if you take buffers from schools, you take setbacks from other retail establishments, you take, a wide range of provisions that apply to cannabis, because that's how it's regulated across the state right now, is pretty specific ordinances applying specifically to cannabis. So I am not trying to argue firmly that there has to be one way or the other, but I do think that you need to, I think it needs to be taken into view, knowing that there's a full section, an entire section that regulates cannabis differently than other uses. So if you apply to be a cannabis establishment, you're not looking at the rest of, the ordinance. You're kind of looking at that section and where do I fit? That's just one thing. So I think it's just part of the puzzle. We definitely have a little puzzle going on. And then just my last thought is just on the, when I put forth those pieces of language, and we decided to kind of move forward with the broadest yes or no, it was intended to allow as much kind of discussion of relevant factors as possible. It wasn't to narrow it down to just yes or no. It was to say we have a full breadth of discussion. So my only concern with this kind of going forward is if that's what the public hearing is for. That's what the joint public hearing is for, is to fully flesh out all the things that need to happen. And if we need to be putting forth language that's so complete that if I didn't put in landscaping, in that language, then we can't talk about landscaping because it wasn't in the initial language. And I think we might be too narrowly construing, the purpose of what we're looking at. So we can get an opinion on this too, if it's helpful to have the group feel comfortable knowing that, in looking at cultivation and highway business, you have the full breadth of things, that you can consider. I see it as you can consider. I don't see it as you can only consider yes or no. So I have a contrary, it's a different opinion different interpretation than Councilor Zarrett, but so I would have appreciate that. I would have to put together like the really comprehensive proposal that would cover. It's not, the nature of this is not to put forth something that will cover every possible thing that will come up. Because that's not possible. Like, you have the opportunity to go through a zoning process and realize, oh, there are these 2-3 other things that are relevant, and we are deciding to include them, and then the final language goes to full city council. So it's just a process question for sure.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, so the one thing the more I think about, so two things. The more I think about this, the more I think that, I just want to clarify, currently this use is not, currently this sort of thing is not allowed. And that we, in considering it, have to limit ourselves to say it either is completely allowed with no restrictions or it is not allowed under any circumstances. I do think we have the ability to say it is allowed, but here are some restrictions we want to put on it. I think that that's fine. but separately, I do think if we are making restrictions that are actually about buildings and not specifically related to cannabis, then that's where I just get a little bit nervous. That being said, I just had a thought, which is that since the last time we met, I now have a family member working in that industry, or a member of my household working in that industry. So I'm going to, I wanted to say that simply as in terms of the open meeting laws conversation, but I'm going to actually, before I say anything else on this, I'm going to reach out to the ethics board and just make sure that this is something, I think it should be fine, but I just want to make sure that this is something that I can be weighing in on without any issues. And until then, I'm just kind of going to sit back and listen.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. All right. I think so. Again, I agree with Jeff, and I'm definitely not somebody that was like. In fact, one of my pet peeves is when people say, "Well, it's always been done this way." That is usually a code for, well, we need to look at that because maybe that's not good. But as far as zone, as I have a de facto experience in zoning, which I never thought I was going to have, but it is so complex that it would almost be impossible to list every potential discussion point as it relates to zoning because it's so diverse. And I do agree with Tom that if this becomes a broader issue beyond cannabis, then we need to. That's something that we would have to reintroduce and look at. So anyway, I mean, here we are. I don't necessarily think we're going to get super far tonight necessarily on this particular topic. Maybe what we should do is just hold off and have the the joint public hearing again with the planning board. And in that time, Jeff, I know you said that getting an opinion. I don't know if that's from the attorney or from the, I imagine you guys have resources at your disposal as far as what is the purview of, because I'm going to have my opinion, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. What is our kind of purview as it relates to looking at zoning issues? How much leeway do we have to look at these things?
Yeah, I mean, I saw Owen's hand out. I think I can do a little bit of research. I may have to talk to the attorney, which is not it's not like going to be this huge bill or anything, just to make sure that the idea going forward is that you can say yes, no, or yes, but with conditions, right? So I think as long as we go into July 14th with an understanding that that's the framework that you can operate in, then I think we have plenty of things to discuss in terms of what is applicable, what should we apply, what's not applicable, where do we draw the line? Like that's definitely the discussion that should happen, at the next hearing. And I'm it's worth just double checking that I'm not trying to push, the scope that I think you have, but we put forth the amendment as general as possible to allow you to address, as many things as you might need to. And I'm not trying to pinpoint what exactly the final decision is, but just that we have that option. That's important to me, that we have that option.
Oh, and did you want to say something? I know Tom has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to belabor this either, and I apologize. And I actually think I love conversations like this because it's what makes government very exciting. And I do appreciate all the work you do, Jeff, so I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I think maybe I was misunderstood the initial wording, and if we had included, I know you can't include every single thing that might come up in discussion, but if we had included in the initial agenda item something about the ordinance committee shall also discuss potential amendments to square footage setbacks and appearance requirements of cannabis cultivation in the highway business district, I think that would have given us a little bit more license to have this discussion, and I would have felt a little bit more comfortable about it because I felt that this was a pretty narrow agenda item. But that's all. But very fair point about the specificity of of an almost inherent bias, but the specificity of the fact that we do have a whole section for cannabis ordinance, and that's a fair point.
Tom?
Yeah, so this is just procedural, but if you're, Jeff, if you're going to be speaking with the solicitor, a point sort of clarification that I'd like to know more about is what happens when you're discussing a specific zoning issue, and in the course of that conversation, it becomes clear that other more comprehensive zoning might be required, what you're allowed to discuss, what you're not allowed to discuss, that sort of thing. That's the one issue going into this whole thing where I get a little bit nervous is if we say, okay, so let's just say number of stories, right? We say, oh, we want it to be under a certain number of stories so it doesn't block the view. And then someone says, oh, okay, well, shouldn't all buildings maybe have that? Okay, but that's not on the agenda. Are we running afoul of something there? Is that something that we can even be discussing, or do we, like, how do we procedurally sort of narrow the scope while still kind of acknowledging that maybe some of the things that we're talking about have less to do with cannabis and more to do with structures in general? Do you?
I mean, I don't want to give false hope. I don't. Having talked to the attorney a fair amount, I don't think he'll opine on that. I don't think it's I think you're raising a good question. I think it's a fair question, but I don't think it's one that, I don't think a legal opinion will help. I think you have to look at kind of the concept that's in front of you. So you are being asked to look at, could there be an impact by allowing cannabis cultivation in the highway business, and do we need to mitigate it? If along the way you like, it sounds like, so there's clearly the discussion of whether this should apply to other buildings, that can be talked about, and it's just, you have to kind of separate your two decisions. One is going to be whether we want to apply any requirements to cannabis and get through that, and then, like I think you previously talked about, so in the discussion it came to light that we should probably be looking at the whole highway business zoning district. You just need to go back and restart the process over and kind of target the broadest category. I mean, I think that's a little less of a legal question. I think we can get through that in the public hearing. I think you're just going to have to keep the two items separate. I mean, they might feed each other, but at the end of the day, you're going to be making a decision on the cannabis question first, and then circle back to maybe a broader. I mean, I did send, it was late, it was sometime today, I did send that highway business report. So I think reading that before the 14th may help support the fact that for several years now, for 7 years, there's been issues, that may need to be addressed in the highway business. Is not, I don't think, well, after you read it, it's not going to be a surprise that there probably needs to be some other amendments that apply across the board.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a real thing. I think it'll just start a separate process, a separate, more broad highway business generally.
And I think that that could be something that this committee is interested in doing. So, and I think we probably want to time it with you, Jeff, just to make sure that you felt like you had the resources and the time to be able to, if that was something that you were interested in as well. But I mean, it seems like we have the desire potentially to look at the zone. So maybe that's.
When I get my new staff person, which is going to take a little while, it'd be easier to accommodate something. I will say that it's going to be a much bigger discussion. It is kind of narrowly focused on cannabis, so at some level it will be easier. But when you start to look at the whole district overall, it's going to be kind of a little bit of a rabbit's nest, like a little bit of a, there's a lot to consider, and the report starts to identify all the things. So I think it's the time and capacity kind of thought process for that one.
Well, and I think probably what it would look like for us is us reviewing the report, having it on our agenda, and then pulling out little pieces that are of most importance, and not tackling them all at once, but tackling them one at a time.
Yeah, I just be, Route 10. There's a lot of stuff going on Route 10. So there's a lot of there are large vacant parcels. There's traffic problems. We would all be embarking on a pretty big project to look at all of the highway business, but it is something that could be worthwhile for sure.
Yep. Great. Any other thoughts, my fellow counselors?
About this topic?
Okay. Well, on this topic.
Oh, no. I think,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff, Brenda. Thanks. So I'm going to move on. So we have plastics on our agenda, and I just wanted to give you guys an update. So I sent it after it was a couple of meetings ago. I had sent it to the president, and so I guess it must have fallen off her radar because she has not sent it. Because I checked in with her today and asked if she had sent it, and she apologized and said it just slipped her mind.
To the attorney?
So it hasn't gotten attorney review yet. But that doesn't mean that. So and she let me see if I can. She said this fell off my radar. Let me pass it on to the attorney. My apologies. So I think that she's sending it out. She sent it probably this evening. And I'm still happy to set the public hearing for August. And if at that time we don't have the attorney review, we can just continue it. I just wanted to make sure that you guys are okay with that. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, perfect. And I mean, I think that might be all we got, unless you guys have anything else you want to talk about.
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, I think maybe before you got here, Owen, I was saying that for some reason on our agenda tonight, the engine brake wasn't listed, but on the full council agenda, it is listed. So I'm going to ask Barbara about that. So in case we do want to revisit that at some point, I just want to make sure that we can. All right. Well, if we don't have anything else, I'm happy to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Motion to adjourn.
Okay. Tom Peake.
Aye.
Oh,
Owen's there.
Wait, was there a second, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I seconded.
Oh, okay.
Tom did.
Just checking.
Oh, you want to stay on for longer? All right, Owen, what do you?
Aye.
Okay, and I as well. So motion passes 3-0. You guys have a wonderful night. We'll see you tomorrow. Hopefully it won't be a 6-hour marathon.
All right.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for taking the time.
Yep.
Right.
I appreciate it. All right, bye, everybody.
See you tomorrow.